Spacesuit. The survival needs of the astronauts in space and on the Moon depends upon the adequate provision of an environment conducive to active survival. For this, they require oxygen to breathe, removal of exhaled carbon dioxide, a pressurized atmosphere, protection against solar radiation, removal of human waste, and protection from extreme temperatures. These needs are particularly pressing during their walkabouts on the Moon when astronauts leave the protected atmosphere of their spaceship. As explained by NASA, spacesuits and the associated backpack are a sophisticated protective garments with oxygen tanks, carbon dioxide scrubbers, active cooling systems, fingertip heaters, and other protective measures. The Apollo Extravehicular Mobility Unit, EMU as NASA referred to as the spacecraft, had 14 layers of insulation material covered by a highly reflective outer layer. It consisted of 15 components ranging from a biological belt for capturing and transmitting biological data, urine and fecal containment systems, big boys nappies to you and me, a liquid cooling garment, communications cap, a modular portable life support system, a boot system, thermal outer gloves, a dosimeter, and a bubble helmet with eye protection. Apollo lunar astronauts performed successful extravehicular activities (EVA) on all Moon missions. Mobility in the spacesuits had to be sufficient for the astronauts to walk about reasonable distances and perform basic tasks in relation to equipment deployment and certain planned experiments. On later missions, mobility was further augmented using Jeep-like lunar roving vehicle. The spacesuit had 14 layers of material to protect the astronaut. The liquid cooling and ventilation garment makes up for the first 3 layers. On top of this garment is the bladder layer, which creates a proper pressure for the body. It also holds in the oxygen for breathing and keeps the correct shape around the astronaut's body and is made of the same material as camping tents. The ripstop liner is a tear-resistant layer. The next 7 layers are mylar insulation and make the suit act like a thermos flask. The layers greatly reduce the changes in the internal temperature. They also protect the astronaut from being harmed by small, high-speed particles flying through space. The outer layer is made of a blend of 3 fabrics. The first fabric is waterproof, the second material is the same as used to build bulletproof vests, Kevlar, and finally the third fabric is fire-resistant. So quite a fancy dress party on the Moon and not an insignificant dressing-up procedure.
Backpack and life support systems.
The life support system was carried by the astronauts in a backpack which weighed about 84 pounds, or just over 14 pounds equivalent weight on the Moon due to the lower 1/6 gravity. Note that the weight appears to be considerably different in NASA documentation. This backpack needed to store all of the essential equipment for survival, including a carbon dioxide scrubber, a pump to circulate water for the body cooling system, fingertip heaters, a fan to circulate oxygen, a 2-way radio for communication, human waste confinement, and a system to regulate suit pressure. All of these electrical systems needed to be powered by a battery. It is no surprise that the backpack weighed upwards of 80 pounds even before it was loaded with liquids and gases. In detail, a spacesuit must perform several functions to allow its occupant to work safely and comfortably inside or outside a spacecraft. It must provide 1. A stable internal pressure. This can be less than Earth's atmosphere, as there is no need for the spacesuit to carry nitrogen, which comprises about 78% of Earth's atmosphere but is not used by the body. Lower pressure allows for greater mobility, but requires the occupant to breathe pure oxygen for some time before going into this lower pressure to avoid decompression sickness, the bends as sea divers know it. 2. Movement is opposed by the pressure of the suit, but mobility can be enhanced by careful joint design. 3. Supply of breathable oxygen. 4. Elimination of exhaled carbon dioxide. 5. Temperature regulation. Unlike on Earth, where heat can be transferred by convection to the atmosphere, in space heat can be lost only by thermal radiation or by conduction to objects in physical contact with the exterior of their suits, boots mainly. The suit must be well insulated and internal air temperature maintained at a comfortable level. 6. A communication system. 7. Means of collecting and containing solid and liquid body waste. 8. Shielding against ultraviolet radiation. 9. Limited shielding against particle radiation. 10. Means to maneuver, dock, release, and or tether onto other spacecraft, stand-up EVA. And lastly, protection against small micrometeoroids, some traveling at up to 27,000 kilometers per hour, provided by a puncture-resistant thermal micrometeoroid garment, which is the outermost layer of the suit. So, quite a complex system to be designed and packaged neatly into a suitcase-sized backpack. NASA state that the lunar EVA times for the first 4 missions, Apollo 11 through 14, were limited to just 4 hours with oxygen stored at 1,020 pounds per square inch, 3.0 pounds of lithium hydroxide, 8.5 pounds, that is 3.9 liters of cooling water, and 279 watt-hours of battery power. For the extended missions, Apollo 15 through 17, the EVA stay time was doubled to 8 hours by increasing stored oxygen to 1,430 pounds per square inch, lithium hydroxide to 3.12 pounds, cooling water to 11.5 pounds, which is 5.2 liters, and a battery capacity of 390 watt-hours. The skeptics naturally ask how the spacesuit managed to supply the electrical power required from a battery which was able to support all of the systems for EVAs of 4 to 8 hours duration. Here we are talking about battery technology from 50 years ago, which one may imagine was far less advanced than we have today. After all, we have experienced 50 years of experimental improvements in battery technology. We now have battery-powered cars, buses, and even aircraft. Imagine that in 1960. I have been unable to find information on the individual watt-hours required by each of the separate components which was used for the electrical power in the backpacks, so I cannot comment on whether 279 watt-hours would be sufficient. Nevertheless, we can make an attempt to analyze what it means. If you consider an EVA of 4 hours, then the astronauts had a maximum 70 watt-hours per hour to power all of the systems in the spacesuit, which is slightly more than a normal 60 watt-hour light bulb. The skeptics argue that this cannot be sufficient power to power all of the systems that the astronauts were carrying, which required electrical power. It was even more critical on the later Apollo missions, for example Apollo 17, when the first EVA was a full 7 hours and 12 minutes. Although NASA do state that they added an extra oxygen tank in the backpacks and increased the battery power to 390 watt-hours. The skeptics reiterate that it is inconceivable that they managed to do a 7-hour EVA with only 54 watt-hours of power per hour, not nearly enough to power a 60-watt light bulb. I reiterate that without the individual power requirements for each subsystem, it is not possible to calculate how many watt-hours were actually required to keep the astronauts alive. In order to get some more focus, let's look at the watt-hours needed by several familiar household electrical appliances to give us some idea of the amount of power needed. Note that these are just broad averages and may vary considerably from country to country. My laptop computer uses 80 watt-hours, my desktop computer 150, my monitor 150, my vacuum cleaner 500, my toaster 1100, room air conditioner 1100, electrical shaver 15, a quarter power drill 250, radio telephone 40, portable fan 100, fish pond pump 3, mains radio clock alarm 50, hair dryer 1500, and a small 12 cubic foot refrigerator 400 watts. As a rough guide to all of the watt total of what is inside the backpack, let's take a radio telephone, 40 watts, a similar portable fan, let's say 50, and a small fish pond pump, 3, which in total would give us 93 watt-hours, greatly in excess of what the astronauts had. So the question repeatedly asked by the skeptics, could 56 watt-hours be enough power to power all of the systems in the backpack? I could find no comments on this by NASA or any of their believers.
Cooling.
The astronauts' bodies were cooled by what NASA refers to as an active cooling system. This consisted of tiny plastic tubes which were woven into an inner bodysuit touching the astronaut's skin. Water was circulated through these tubes to take the heat away from the body. The heat is ultimately transferred to the thin sheet of ice which is expired into the vacuum of space. Due to the extremely low pressure in space, the heated ice sublimates directly into water vapor, which is then vented away from the suit. In addition to the variable battery power, the other limiting consumables on the Apollo EVAs were not only oxygen for breathing, but the water that was used for the sublimation cooling system. Here, the skeptics have a problem in that the astronauts seemingly carried so little water for the EVA that they performed. In the early Apollo missions, Apollo 11 through 14, they carried just 3.9 liters for a 4-hour EVA. The skeptics point out that this is less than 1 liter per hour. In the later Apollo missions, Apollo 15 through 17, they carried just 5.2 liters of water for EVA times of more than 7 hours, so just 0.72 liters per hour, about 1.27 pints. The skeptics question whether such a small amount of water flow would be sufficient to cool the astronauts to any meaningful degree. Again, we have no significant comments on this from NASA or their believers.
Gravity.
If you have been paying attention, then you will know by now that the Moon's gravity is only 1/6 of that of the Earth. This is due to the relative sizes of the Earth and the Moon, and therefore their masses. I personally recall a magazine article in the 1960s about the Moon and its much lower gravity than on Earth. The article highlighted the fact that humans would be super athletes on the Moon due to a much lower gravitational force. On Earth, an average athlete can do a standing vertical jump of about 2 feet, so they postulated that on the Moon, a man could do a standing vertical jump of at least 12 feet high, or maybe 6 feet high in a spacesuit. Similarly, a man could do a standing long jump of 4 feet on Earth, so they expected him to do a long jump of at least 8 feet on the Moon. I, and I imagine many others, couldn't wait to see the display of superpowers our comic book superheroes finally brought to life. Naturally, the astronauts were not kitted out for athletics like Nike trainers and shorts, but nonetheless they would be able to amaze us with their new powers. These athletic superpowers were even confidently predicted in 1964 by NASA. Well, we were all bitterly disappointed. The astronauts did nothing to amaze us. In fact, they looked rather pedestrian. When they did make an effort to jump, it was only about a maximum of 18 inches, seemingly nothing different from being on Earth. Naturally, they were wearing their spacesuits and backpacks, but their terrestrial muscles must have been adapted to Earth's gravity, then they should have been much stronger on the Moon. The initial force that the astronaut can exert just before he jumps is the same on the Earth or on the Moon. It is not a function of gravity, but purely muscle strength. The skeptics have labored on this point that the astronauts did not appear to be in lesser gravity than on Earth, which leads them to suggest that they never left Earth in the first place. You can see in Apollo 11 that at the foot of the ladder, Buzz Aldrin has just descended and he practices getting back up the ladder. He has 2 attempts to pull himself up about 2 feet. The skeptics would have imagined in 1/6 gravity that it would be much easier than he made it look. After all, he has the same terrestrial arm muscles and only 1/6 the weight. However, the believers point out that in this video sequence from Apollo 16, in which the astronauts John Young and Charlie Duke performed some high jumping antics, as seen in this video posted. Certainly, they do not appear to be jumping 3 feet into the air, but for some unexplained reason, they do it behind some equipment so that you cannot see their legs. Yes, you can hear the skeptics crying, "Trampoline!" However, one strange thing to note in this video, which occurs at time frame .11, when Young states that we're going to do a bunch of exercises. He proceeds to arch his body, bend his knees, and make 4 determined jumps, then stops, but then suddenly and mysteriously he is yanked up by some unseen force. All rather strange, and has our skeptics immediately yelling, "Wires!" Skeptic Probe NASA also has many comments of this possible use of wire supports. I have tried to imagine what it would be like to walk in 1/6 gravity. No doubt easier because I would feel much lighter, but would I have adopted that bunny jumping method that the astronauts did? I can remember when I first saw this, I felt that it was somehow strange, as it was not at all what I expected to see. I am not the only one to consider how their movements were strange. The skeptics also think the same. In fact, the skeptics say that the astronauts are running in Earth's gravity and the video has been slowed down to give them the bouncing effect. They postulate that NASA must have experimented with various types of locomotion for the astronauts here on Earth, but perhaps none looked convincing enough for the moonwalking. It has been suggested by many skeptics that NASA found that the astronauts running, then being slowed down, the video gave the effect that their feet were in the air a bit longer, giving the impression of less gravity and that bouncy floaty feel. Who knows? Perhaps the expert on moonwalking, Michael Jackson, could have offered some useful advice. The skeptics say that it was all veering on the comical as shown in the NASA video footage shown by skeptic Probe NASA. This strange, hurried way of jumping along instead of walking caused the astronauts to fall over on many occasions, as you see in this video, and remember that one tear in their spacesuit could mean possible sudden death, as their bodily fluids would immediately start to outgas or boil. There was also the added danger that they may break an ankle, a leg, a wrist, or an arm, which would prove disastrous on the moon. The skeptics doubt that NASA would have condoned this method of locomotion if the astronauts really were in a hostile climate such as the moon. It would have been deemed far too dangerous. There is even one NASA video in which an astronaut suit appears to be torn. It is not entirely clear in this video that the suit is torn. It could simply be that the material was just folded. Our most prolific skeptic, Jara White, also makes his contribution to the gravity debate. Now, what makes this whole locomotion thing doubtedly strange is that the astronauts practiced many hours here on Earth using a gravity harness which simulated 1/6 gravity of the moon. In all of these tests, they walked just normally as one would expect, no bobbing up and down. It was not as though it was something they learned by experience on the moon, as Armstrong and Aldrin very soon started the bobbing locomotion on the first Apollo missions. So one has to wonder, why when they got to the moon did they adopt a totally different method of locomotion from that they spent months practicing in Earth simulation tests? We have a veritable queue of believers who wish to demonstrate that the videos on the moon actually prove, without doubt, the lower gravity on the moon. I have selected just 4 of the believers who offer what they claim to be absolute proof that the astronauts are actually on the moon. I did say there was a queue. Now we need to be clear on what the believers are actually attempting to prove. They say that the astronauts must have been on the moon, as they can prove that they were under the influence of the moon's lower gravity. This unfortunately does not necessarily follow that the skeptics would argue that the effects of lower gravity equivalent to that of the moon could have been simulated by NASA here on Earth. We have already seen that NASA did use gravity harnesses to simulate the moon's lower gravity for astronaut training. In our first believer's proof from Brant Watson, or aka Astro Brant 2, a portion of a video from Apollo 16 is examined in which astronaut John Young flips a piece of fabric into the air. The video examines the trajectory of its flight and at the time the object takes to fall to show that the gravitational pull is indeed what would be expected on the moon. In order to counter the inevitable retorts from the skeptics that the video was filmed on Earth and shown slower to compensate for the differences in gravity, the video is also run at the speed required if it had been shot in Earth's gravity. Clearly, the astronauts are then moving in a comical manner and far too fast for it to be realistic. Our second proof occurs on the Apollo 14 mission when astronaut Ed Mitchell opens the Scientific Equipment Bay (SEQ), and fortunately for the believers, a strap falls down and begins to swing like a pendulum for a good 2 minutes. The mathematical theory of pendulums is well known. Given the timing of swing and the length of the pendulum, it is possible to calculate the force of gravity. What could have been more fortuitous for the believers? A mathematical proof of gravity, serendipity at its finest. This is the basis of our second believer's proof by Montegala. The Apollo 14 SEQ Bay quasi-pendulum is used to demonstrate that the harmonics of the pendulum created by the hanging strap conform exactly with what would be expected in the moon's 1/6 gravity, and further proof from NASA themselves. The length of the pendulum and the time of the swing are used to calculate that it does indeed appear to be under the influence of a lower gravitational force as would be observed on the moon. Again, a speeded-up version of the video is also shown here to counter the unusual argument by the skeptics that it was filmed here on Earth and then broadcast at a slower speed to mimic the moon's gravity. Again, when the video is speeded up, the astronauts' movements do appear to be unrealistically rapid. We have discussed astronauts jumping in lunar gravity earlier in this video. In that discussion, we talked about the height jumped, as our skeptics were expecting to see some super athletes, but it appears that they were wrongfully disappointed. However, videos of the astronauts jumping can also provide evidence how fast they were falling, and thus demonstrate the influence of the gravity that they were under. This mathematical analysis is carried out on our final believer's proof of the lesser gravity on the moon from Shane Keelan. The height of John Young's jump in the Apollo mission, in which he salutes the American flag, is estimated using the resolution of the video and counting the height of the jump in the video in pixels. The video frame rate provides the timing for the fall. Again, we are shown that the astronaut appears to be under a lower gravitational equivalent to that on the moon. The believer's evidence in these 4 videos appears to demonstrate that the believer's moon landing theory is correct, and the concise mathematics is hard to question. I am beginning to wonder, have we found that single piece of irrefutable proof that man was actually on the moon? Hold on, not so fast, shout the skeptics. We have more to say about this gravitational debate before you hastily conclude that there was no fakery involved. In passing, we need to mention that there is something puzzling about the jump video used to calculate the gravitational force above. The actual jump does not look very realistic. The problem is that the moon dust does not follow the astronaut's feet into the air to the high point of the jump, but falls away rather too quickly, as discussed by Steve the Chemist in his very convincing presentation. Our skeptics would ask you to watch the video again and notice that the astronaut's backpack appears to start rising before the body of the astronaut in this frame-by-frame video by True Group. In particular, notice the space between the bottom of his backpack and the shadow of his backside. It increases. This is strange, as we would normally expect the astronaut to rise first, then pull up the backpack with his body. So we should see that the backpack initially comes down lower on his body, not higher as he jumps. The skeptics are suggesting that the explanation for the small amount of moon dust falling from his boots and the backpack going up before the astronaut is that the astronaut is being pulled up on some harness contraption attached to the backpack. The rather bizarre Apollo 16 jumping video has also attracted the detailed attention of our skeptic Hunchback to question what we are really seeing in this video. He examines the 2 jump salutes and notices a very strange twisting movement in the second jump which he cannot explain. He also points out that the strange rising of the backpack, this time by noting that the position of the top of the astronaut's head relative to the backpack. Considerably more food for thought. Briefly, in several NASA videos taken of the Apollo missions, the American flag appears to move as though being blown by the wind. On the moon, that should not be possible as there is virtually no atmosphere. The believers and skeptics alike have incessantly debated if the flag appears to be on the moon or in a studio set on Earth being disturbed by the air conditioning. But the waving flag also has other uses related to gravity. The vertical edge of the flag can be considered to be a crude pendulum. I hear you all moaning, what, more pendulums? Well, I'm afraid yes, just one more pendulum. In the evidence presented in the work by skeptic Steve the Chemist, in which he examines the physics of the swinging movement of the flag in the Apollo 15 video. It happens as astronaut Dave Scott passes the flag, it sets off a simple harmonic motion. By counting the periodicity of the flag movement, then it is theoretically possible to calculate the gravity of the place at which the video was filmed, either on the moon or here on Earth. All you need to understand is that the length of the pendulum and the speed that it swings is a function of gravity at that place. Similar to the swinging pendulum from the SEQ Bay video mentioned above, in which the hanging strap acted like a pendulum. He shows rather convincingly that in his opinion, the video of the waving flag was filmed on Earth and not on the moon. So we face the dichotomy that our believers see that these videos of proof that they were filmed on the moon, and our skeptics see the same videos as proof that they were filmed here on Earth. So confusion at its highest level, but don't despair, we have more on gravity from our merry band of skeptics. Of particular interest in this series by Make Believe and the video which discusses lunar gravity, but more on that later.
Carrying the backpack.
Let's for a moment think of gravity from a human scale here on Earth. The astronaut spacesuit and backpack weighed in at about 180 pounds, and let's take a typical weight for an average astronaut at 170 pounds. Your allowance on checked-in baggage on many commercial flights is now typically 44 pounds or 20 kilos, so the astronaut suit clobber is 4 times that. Imagine 4 times what you struggle to lift onto the conveyor at a check-in or off the carousel on arrival. Fortunately for our astronauts on the moon, all this is reduced by a factor of 6 due to the lesser gravity on the moon. Now let's visualize an astronaut carrying this backpack here on Earth. How would he do it? In order to stand upright, then his center of gravity needs to be within the contact area of his feet. What happens when you place a backpack on your back that is the same weight as you? In order to keep your center of gravity within the contact area of your feet, then you must lean forward, otherwise you may fall over backwards. The important thing to realize is that this weight slung on your back, then it is totally impossible to stand upright. You must bend forward to bring your new center of gravity over your feet. Naturally, everything will weigh much less on the moon, but the balance problem will not change. They are just the same irrespective of the lighter weight on the moon. This is simply a matter of dynamics on the center of gravity and balance, not the actual weight. You could try the same thing with a child's doll. It is solely the dynamics of balance. So our skeptics expect our astronauts to be leaning forward, even perhaps so slightly, to bring their center of gravity over the contact area of their feet. So what will we see in Apollo videos as our astronauts bob around on the moon? Anyone bending over? Well, no. They appear to be walking and bobbing around totally upright. The skeptics ask, how can this be? How do they manage to balance the large weight on their backs and still remain totally upright? In order to understand the point that the skeptics are making, you can try it yourself at home. See if you can totally carry your own weight on your back and remain totally upright. I just tried to piggyback my reluctant neighbor who had a similar build as me, and believe me, I really had to bend well forward to retain my balance. My neighbor was more than curious to see why I wanted to piggyback him around the garden, so I explained the dilemma. He, being something more of a mathematics freak, made some quick calculations and told me that I would need to bend over forwards by 30 degrees in order to keep my balance. Did we see any astronauts in this ungainly position? So the skeptic's question is, how did the Apollo astronauts manage to do this so easily? Not just easily, but for 4 to 7 hours in one EVA. Think about that one, and watch the astronauts dance around in the Apollo videos again. Perhaps our skeptics have a legitimate concern here. One of our skeptics, Steve the chemist, has something to say about this posture thing as he examines the physics on the moonwalk. He examines the posture of the humans in relation to their center of gravity and contends that the astronauts could not have walked around on the moon in a total upright position, but the Apollo videos show us clearly that they did, and for long periods of time. I found the mention of friction very intriguing and something that I had not mentioned before. The frictional force is a product of the weight of the object times the coefficient of friction, so as the weight decreases, so does the frictional force. Therefore, the much lesser gravitational force on the moon would also reduce the friction of our astronauts' feet by the same amount. Steve the chemist believes from his analysis that the astronauts would have been walking on the equivalent of ice. Interestingly, this foot slippage due to reduction of friction on the lunar surface was predicted by NASA. Above, you will observe the very point that Steve the chemist was making. Believer MC² has some criticism of Steve the chemist's video. He maintains that the center of gravity points shown are incorrect and shows diagrams of how he thinks it should look. Unfortunately, MC² has the center of gravity for the astronaut's body in the wrong place. The center of gravity of a human is central in the body just above the navel. This question of balance of the astronauts is an intriguing one, as we will often see them in the NASA videos stumbling and falling over. Finally, we have an intriguing clip from skeptic Lawrence Howlings which shows the Apollo 17 astronaut Jack Schmitt falling. Howlings contends that some wire supporting the astronaut is too taut to allow him to bend over, and as a consequence, he stumbles and falls. Somehow, he appears to be suspended in mid-air, sort of floating horizontally. Howlings considers this to be a true smoking gun, as the position of the astronaut suspended horizontally defies the law of gravity.
Impressions in the sand.
The devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape. William Shakespeare, Hamlet. Before we get started on moon dust, footprints, tire tracks, and craters on the moon, let's do some basic science first so that we can understand what this subject is all about. Firstly, we will talk about rocket thrust, and you may ask, what is that? When we are all up to speed on rocket thrust, we can then talk about blast craters or lack of them. We will also examine footprints and tire tracks before we blast off from the moon. Rocket thrust. A pound of thrust is the amount of thrust it would take to keep a 1-pound object stationary against the force of gravity here on Earth. It is often referred to as the buoyancy force as it keeps the object floating like a boat in water, but in our case in the air. The more scientific definition is given by the International System of Units as the Newton and represents the amount of force needed to accelerate 1 kilogram of mass at the rate of 1 meter per second per second. In this video series, we will stick to our imperial measurements as they were used by NASA. Hopefully, so far, so good. The descent engine of the lunar lander has a 10,500-pound thrust throttleable rocket to enable it to land safely on the moon. So, what pressures would one expect a 10,500-pound thrust rocket engine to exert below the engine at the exit area, also sometimes referred to as the skirt? Now, pressure is simply the thrust exerted per unit area, measured in pounds per square inch psi. I bet you wish you had paid much closer attention in that science class. The diameter of the descent stage rocket skirt, as exhibited in the Smithsonian Air and National Space Museum, was 54.5 inches, which gives a total area of about 2,333 square inches. Remember from school, area equals pi times radius squared, so our 10,500-pound thrust rocket engine would give us a total of 10,500 divided by 2,333 square inches of area, which is 4.5 pounds per square inch, psi. Headache, anyone? Now, according to NASA, the descent engine would not be running at 100% as it was approaching the lunar surface, but would slowly be throttled back to no more than 3,000-pound thrust. So we need to amend our figure of thrust by the ratio of 3,000 divided by 10,500, which is 0.29. Finally, we have our estimate of pressure at the skirt exit when the lunar module was landing, which is in the region of 1.3 psi. But wait! There is one more thing before you go lie down for that well-earned rest. The discussion above about the pressure produced by rockets was in Earth's atmosphere. Now the air pressure on Earth is about 14.7 psi, and this sideways air pressure will help constrain the exhaust jet in a fairly tight cone. On the moon, there is no atmosphere, hence no side pressure, so the exhaust jet would be able to expand sideways, thus increasing the area over which the pressure is distributed. Our figure of 1.3 psi would therefore be lower. How much lower and at what distance will be a guess, but let's make a guess anyways. I can well imagine that the reduction would be considerable, but I really do not know at this point. I will make the assumption that it will increase the blast area by 100% to 4,666 square inches. Note that some believers have assumed a much larger increase of up to 200%. However, I will use my 100% and do the calculations again, so our jet pressure would be halved to 0.65 psi. So what does 0.65 psi of pressure mean in the real world? Well, as a guide, the pressure of a typical garden leaf blower is about 5 to 10 pound thrust. We will assume an average of 7 pounds and let's say a typical skirt area of 40 square inches, say 2.5 inch nozzle size, would give approximately 0.18 psi, 7 pounds divided by 40 square inches. Moving up in size, we can look at the Rolls-Royce engine on a Harrier jump jet with 22,000 pounds thrust through a 38-inch diameter engine skirt, which gives us about 19 psi. So now we have some vague idea of the forces we are dealing with: a garden leaf blower with 0.18 psi, our descent stage with 0.65 psi, and the Harrier jump jet with 19 psi. Note that all these pressures will reduce as we move farther away from the engine and the affected area increases, so reducing the pressure. If you stand exactly behind the Harrier jump jet, you are likely to be propelled to the moon, but stand 100 yards away and you will just about remain here on Earth. Got the idea? As a further point of interest, an astronaut wearing size 11 moon boots would make a boot print of about 60 square inches with each footstep as he strolled around the moon. On Earth, he would typically weigh 175 pounds plus the 180-pound spacesuit and backpack, so 355 pounds in total. On the Moon, he would only weigh 1/6 of that, so say 59 pounds. Therefore, he would exert a pressure of 0.98 psi, 59 over 60, with each step. The important thing to understand is that surprisingly, an astronaut's boot exerts considerably more pressure than our descent engine per square inch of area. Admittedly, my calculations are full of estimates, and I am sure that there are many of you who could do a better job, but we do now have a better understanding of what is involved. It may have been a pain to go through this, but all of this is relevant for our discussion and for the understanding of what follows. Go take a rest, come back refreshed, more pressure to come. Oh, I inadvertently made a pun.